Mortar shells exploded in thunderous succession around Firebase Crimson, each blast closer than the last. Shrapnel screaming through the mountain air as Sergeant First Class Riley Hawthorne dove behind a crumbling concrete barrier, her tactical radio crackling with desperate voices from her surrounded unit. Crimson Base, this is Falcon Team. We are taking heavy fire from 3 sides. Ammunition running critical. Request immediate extraction. But the only response was static, the main communication tower a twisted wreck of metal and sparking cables. 50 meters away, destroyed in the first wave of the ambush that had turned their routine patrol into a nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 23 years old with steel gray eyes that had seen too much combat in too few years, Riley pressed her back against the concrete as another explosion sent debris raining down around her position. Her unit of 12 soldiers was trapped in the abandoned outpost they'd been sent to investigate, pinned down by an enemy force that seemed to know their every move, their every weakness. The mission had been simple: check the old Soviet-era Firebase in the Karakesh Mountains for insurgent activity, gather intelligence, and return to base before nightfall. Instead, they'd walked straight into a carefully orchestrated trap that suggested someone had been feeding their enemies detailed information about coalition patrol routes. Hawthorne. Corporal Jake Morrison crawled toward her position, his left arm hanging at an awkward angle, blood seeping through his torn sleeve. The LT's down, Rodriguez is hit bad, and we've got maybe 40 rounds between the whole squad. They're moving in for the kill. His voice carried the edge of panic that even seasoned soldiers couldn't completely suppress when death felt inevitable. Riley looked through the gathering dusk at the muzzle flashes lighting up the ridgelines around them, counting at least 30 hostile positions, maybe more. Professional fighters, well-equipped and coordinated. Not the usual ragtag insurgents they typically encountered in this sector. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, forcing herself to think clearly despite the chaos erupting around them. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, lessons from late-night training sessions when she was barely 16. When all communications fail, when you're cut off from command, when death is closing in from all sides, remember calcine Phantom 7. It's a frequency that officially doesn't exist, monitored by people who officially aren't there. Last resort only, kiddo. But if you ever need a miracle, that's where you'll find it. Major Thomas Hawthorne had been Special Operations Command's most decorated communications specialist before his death in Afghanistan 3 years ago, a loss that had shattered Riley's world and driven her to enlist against her mother's desperate protests. He died during a classified mission. Circumstances never fully explained. Body never recovered. Just a folded flag and hollow condolences that felt like lies. But before his final deployment, he'd spent months teaching his daughter advanced communication protocols, showing her frequency combinations that weren't in any manual, preparing her for scenarios he hoped she'd never face. Riley grabbed the damaged tactical radio from Morrison's gear, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The main antenna was bent but functional, the encryption module cracked but still displaying green status lights. She'd need to bypass the standard communication channels entirely, access emergency frequencies that required manual input rather than preset channels. "What are you doing?" Morrison asked, wincing as another mortar round impacted 30 meters away, close enough to shower them with hot concrete fragments. "Calling for help," Riley replied, her fingers working quickly to remove the radio's protective casing, exposing the internal frequency controls that most soldiers never saw. "There's someone out there who might answer." She spun the frequency. Dial to a combination her father had made her memorize: 7. 7.4.5.9, an impossible frequency according to official doctrine, supposedly reserved for atmospheric research rather than military communications. But her father had insisted it was monitored by assets so classified that acknowledging their existence would require security clearances above his pay grade. The radio crackled with static as she activated the emergency beacon, broadcasting their GPS coordinates automatically while she spoke into the microphone with a voice that carried across 3 years of grief and loss. Phantom 7. This is Crimson Base. We are 12 souls at grid reference 41. 7,852 north, 74.3617 east. Taking heavy fire from superior force. All standard comes down. Casualties mounting. Requesting immediate assistance from any asset in range. The words felt strange on her tongue, using her father's old call sign, as if she had any right to it. As if speaking his code might somehow bring him back from whatever grave the mountains had claimed. Silence stretched for 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours, while enemy fire intensified around their position. Morrison looked at her with the expression of someone watching a final desperate gamble, knowing that if this failed, they'd all be dead within the hour. Then the radio erupted with a voice that made Riley's blood turn to ice water. A transmission that defied everything she thought she knew about life and death, and the frequencies where ghosts might linger. Crimson Base, this is Phantom 7 Actual. The voice was unmistakable despite the static, unchanged despite 3 years of silence, carrying the same calm authority that had guided her through countless training exercises. I hear you loud and clear, kiddo. Help is already on the way. Riley stared at the radio, her hands trembling not from fear but from impossible recognition. Morrison grabbed her shoulder, his voice urgent. Who is that? How do they know you? But she couldn't answer, couldn't explain that the voice belonged to her father, couldn't make sense of how a dead man was responding to their desperate call for salvation. Outside their crumbling fortress, the enemy continued their advance, unaware that they just triggered a response from someone who officially didn't exist. Someone whose call sign had been retired with full honors 3 years ago. Someone who apparently had been waiting in the shadows for his daughter's voice to call across the frequencies where the living and the dead might somehow meet. The impossible had happened. Phantom 7 was still operational. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 hours earlier, Sergeant. First Class Riley Hawthorne had been sitting in the mess hall at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, picking at her reconstituted eggs and watching the morning briefing displays cycle through routine patrol assignments. At 5 feet 6 inches with dark auburn hair pulled back in regulation style, she looked unremarkable among the other soldiers preparing for another day of operations in the Karakesh Mountains. Most of her unit saw her as competent but quiet. The kind of soldier who followed orders without complaint, performed her duties efficiently, and rarely drew attention to herself. What they didn't know was that Riley possessed technical knowledge that exceeded most communications specialists with twice her experience. While other soldiers spent their off-duty time playing video games or writing letters home, Riley studied frequency allocation charts, memorized emergency protocols, and practiced radio repair techniques that weren't covered in standard training manuals. Her personal footlocker contained civilian electronics magazines, antenna theory textbooks, and notebooks filled with signal propagation calculations written in her careful handwriting. She joined the Army 18 months ago, enlisting as a Taungi communications specialist despite having no military family tradition, no burning patriotic calling, no clear career path that led naturally to military service. The recruiting sergeant had been surprised when a college graduate with a degree in electrical engineering had walked into his office, asking about communications roles rather than officer training programs. Riley had deflected his questions with vague answers about wanting to serve her country, wanting practical experience, wanting to honor family tradition. The truth was more complicated and more painful than she'd been willing to share with anyone. Riley Hawthorne was searching for answers about her father's death, and the military seemed like the only place she might find them. Major Thomas Hawthorne had died during a classified operation in Afghanistan 3 years ago, but the official reports contained gaps that didn't make sense to anyone who understood military communications procedures. He'd supposedly been killed during a routine intelligence gathering mission, but his daughter knew he'd been working on something far more complex than routine intelligence. During her childhood, her father had been deployed more often than he'd been home, but when he was present, he'd been an intense and dedicated teacher. While other military kids learned to throw footballs or ride bicycles, Riley had learned to calculate signal strength, understand propagation characteristics, and troubleshoot communication equipment that most adults found impossibly complex. Knowledge is the only inheritance that can't be stolen, he'd told her during one late-night lesson when she was 15. His hands steady as he demonstrated proper antenna tuning techniques at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Riley had quickly developed a reputation for solving communication problems that stumped more experienced technicians. When radios failed in the field, Riley could often repair them with improvised parts and creative rewiring. When atmospheric conditions disrupted normal frequency bands, Riley knew alternative channels that maintained clear communication. Her squad leaders had learned to consult her before calling for technical support, knowing she could usually solve problems faster than official channels. But Riley's technical competence came with emotional distance that her fellow soldiers found difficult to understand. She participated in unit activities when required, maintained professional relationships with her teammates, and performed every assigned duty with meticulous attention to detail. Yet she remained fundamentally apart from the casual camaraderie that bound most military units together. During evening downtime, while other soldiers shared stories about home, discussed their plans after discharge, or complained about military bureaucracy, Riley would disappear to work on personal projects or study technical manuals. Corporal Jake Morrison, her closest friend in the unit, had once asked her directly why she seemed to be holding herself at arm's length from everyone around her. "You're good at this job, Hawthorne, better than most people with years more experience. But it's like you're here for reasons you won't talk about. Like you're looking for something the rest of us can't see." Riley had deflected the question with a joke about preferring machines to people. But Morrison's observation had been uncomfortably accurate. The morning of the patrol that would change everything, Riley had checked her equipment with the same methodical precision she brought to every mission. Her tactical radio was functioning within normal parameters. Her backup communication devices were charged and tested. Her antenna configurations were optimized for the mountainous terrain they'd be crossing. She'd studied the mission briefing carefully, noting the locations where terrain might interfere with standard communication frequencies, planning alternative channels if normal. Procedures failed. What she hadn't planned for was walking into a sophisticated ambush designed by enemies who seemed to understand coalition communication procedures better than they should have. What she hadn't expected was finding herself in a situation where standard protocols offered no solutions, where survival would depend on knowledge that officially didn't exist, where the only hope for rescue would come from frequencies that weren't supposed to be monitored by anyone. Still living. As Riley had packed her gear that morning, checking and rechecking her radio equipment with obsessive care, she'd touched the small compass her father had given her years ago, its back engraved with coordinates that meant nothing to anyone else but had guided her through every important decision since his death. She'd whispered the same words she spoke every morning before dangerous missions. "Watch over your daughter. Major, don't let me dishonor what you taught me." She had no way of knowing that within hours, she'd be calling across frequencies reserved for the dead, speaking codes that shouldn't work anymore, reaching for help from someone who couldn't possibly answer. But that was exactly what her father had prepared her for during all those late-night training sessions, the moment when impossible situations required impossible solutions. When survival depended on knowledge passed from one generation to the next. When love took the form of technical competence under extreme pressure, Riley Hawthorne was about to discover that some lessons transcend death, that some frequencies remain open even after official channels go silent, and that the most important inheritance her father had left her wasn't equipment or manuals, but the unshakable belief that help would always be available. To those who knew the right codes to call it, Major Thomas Hawthorne had been 3 days away from retirement when he volunteered for one final mission in the Hindu Kush Mountains, a decision that would haunt his daughter for the rest of her life. 22 years of distinguished service in Special Operations Command, 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and a reputation as the most innovative communications specialist in the entire military, all of it ending with a single encrypted message that arrived at their family home in Colorado Springs at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning that Riley would never forget. We regret to inform you that Major Thomas Hawthorne was killed in action during operations in Afghanistan. Due to the classified nature of his mission, no additional details can be provided at this time. His sacrifice will not be forgotten. 43 words that shattered a world Riley had built around her father's larger-than-life presence. 43 words that raised more questions than they answered. 43 words that began 3 years of sleepless nights and unanswered letters to military bureaucrats who claimed they couldn't provide information that didn't exist. The funeral had been a military spectacle with full honors, flag-draped coffin, honor guard, and a 21-gun salute that echoed across Arlington National Cemetery like thunder. But Riley had stared at that coffin knowing it was empty, knowing her father's body had never been recovered, knowing that somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, Thomas Hawthorne had simply vanished without explanation. The officials who spoke at the service used phrases like ultimate sacrifice and died serving his country, but none of them could look Riley in the eye when she asked direct questions about what had actually happened. Colonel Patricia Valdez, her father's commanding officer for the previous 6 years, had pulled Riley aside after the ceremony with tears streaming down her weathered face. Your father was working on something revolutionary, something that could have changed how we conduct operations in hostile territory. But the project was so classified that even I don't know the details. What I can tell you is that he believed his work would save lives, possibly hundreds of lives. He died pursuing something he thought was worth the risk. That conversation had planted seeds of obsession that grew into Riley's determination to understand what her father had really been doing during his final months. She'd spent her senior year of college researching military communication systems, studying classified frequency allocations, learning about experimental technologies that existed in the gray areas between official doctrine and operational necessity. Her electrical engineering professors had been impressed by her focus on military applications, assuming she was planning a career with defense contractors rather than seeking answers about her father's death. What Riley discovered through careful research was that her father had been involved in developing something called the Phantom Network, a communication system designed to operate independently of normal military infrastructure, using frequency combinations that weren't officially allocated to any government agency. The concept was revolutionary: create backup communication channels that could function even if enemy forces managed to destroy or compromise primary systems. But the project had been canceled abruptly 3 years ago. All research classified beyond her security clearance level. The night before she'd left for basic training, Riley had driven to the storage facility where her father's personal effects were kept. Boxes of equipment and documents that the military had returned to the family after appropriate security reviews. Most of it was standard communication gear, technical manuals, and personal items that meant little to anyone outside the family. But buried at the bottom of the largest box, wrapped in an old army blanket, she'd found a piece of equipment she'd never seen before. The device looked like a modified tactical radio, but with frequency ranges that extended far beyond normal military specifications. Attached to it was a notebook filled with her father's handwriting, pages of calculations and frequency assignments that made no sense according to standard communication protocols. On the final page, written in his careful script, was a message clearly intended for her. "Riley, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. The frequencies in this book aren't in any manual, aren't supposed to exist, but they work. They're monitored by people who officially aren't there, operated by assets so classified that acknowledging them would require security clearances I don't have. If you ever need help that can't come through normal channels, use calsign Phantom 7 on frequency 7.7.4.5.9. Tell them you're Thomas Hawthorne's daughter. Tell them the ghost is calling home." Riley had stared at that message for hours, trying to understand what her father had expected her to do with such information. At the time, it had seemed like paranoid fantasy, the kind of conspiracy theory that grieving family members sometimes constructed to make sense of senseless loss. She'd packed the radio and notebook away, telling herself she'd probably never need to understand what her father had been trying to tell her. But during her military training, she'd begun to notice inconsistencies in official communication, procedures that suggested her father's fantasy might have been based on reality, frequency allocations that appeared in classified manuals but weren't mentioned in standard training, communication protocols that seemed designed to bypass normal command structures, equipment modifications that weren't covered in technical specifications, but seemed to be common knowledge among experienced operators. Her drill sergeants had been surprised by her advanced knowledge of communication systems, her ability to troubleshoot problems that shouldn't have been familiar to someone without prior military experience. When they asked where she'd learned such specialized skills, Riley had deflected with vague references to her father's influence, never mentioning the hours they'd spent together working on equipment that officially didn't exist. The truth was that Thomas Hawthorne had been preparing his daughter for scenarios he hoped she'd never face, teaching her skills he prayed she'd never need to use. Every late-night lesson, every technical demonstration, every frequency memorization drill had been his way of ensuring that if something happened to him, if he disappeared into the classified shadows where his work existed, he could still protect her from dangers she couldn't imagine. He'd known that his work with the Phantom network made him a target, that enemies of the United States would kill to obtain or destroy the communication capabilities he was developing. He'd also known that if those enemies ever connected him to his family, his daughter might someday find herself in a situation where normal help wasn't available, where survival would depend on knowledge that existed outside official channels. Riley had carried her father's compass through every day of her military service, its weight a constant reminder of lessons learned and promises made. She'd practiced the frequency combinations he'd taught her, maintained the modified radio he'd left behind, prepared herself for the possibility that someday she might need to call across channels that weren't supposed to exist to reach people who officially weren't there. She'd never imagined that the day would come when she'd find herself surrounded by enemies in a remote mountain outpost, calling desperately for help that couldn't arrive through normal means. She'd never expected to hear her father's voice responding to her emergency call, speaking calmly across 3 years of death and grief, as if he'd been waiting by his radio for her to need him. But Thomas Hawthorne had prepared his daughter well, teaching her that love sometimes took the form of impossible preparation for unthinkable situations, that the most important inheritance a parent could leave was knowledge that transcended death itself. The training had begun when Riley was 13. though she hadn't understood its significance at the time. Every Friday evening after dinner, Thomas Hawthorne would disappear into his workshop, a converted garage filled with radio equipment, computer screens, and walls covered with frequency charts that looked like mathematical puzzles to anyone without specialized knowledge. "Come on, kiddo," he'd call to Riley, who was usually absorbed in homework or video games. "Time for our weekly technical session." What had started as casual father-daughter bonding had evolved into intensive training that went far beyond anything taught in civilian electronics courses or even basic military communication schools. Thomas would begin each session with theoretical concepts, signal propagation, atmospheric interference, frequency allocation principles, before moving to hands-on exercises that required Riley to demonstrate practical understanding under increasingly challenging conditions. "Communication isn't just about talking," he'd explained during one memorable session when Riley was 15, his hands steady as he guided her through the process of building a frequency scanner from salvaged components. "It's about reaching the right people at the right time using methods that can't be intercepted, jammed, or compromised by hostile forces. The military teaches soldiers to use equipment that works 99% of the time. I'm teaching you to solve problems during the 1% when everything else fails." The lessons had been structured like a military curriculum, with each skill building upon previous knowledge until Riley possessed capabilities that exceeded most professional communication specialists. Thomas had taught her to recognize different types of signal interference, to distinguish between natural atmospheric disruption and intentional jamming, to calculate optimal antenna configurations for various terrain conditions, and to repair damaged equipment using improvised materials found in hostile environments. But the most important lessons had focused on what Thomas called shadow frequencies communication, channels that existed outside normal allocation procedures, monitored by assets that operated independently of standard command structures. "Every government has communication networks that officially don't exist," he'd explained, his voice carrying the weight of experience Riley wouldn't fully understand until years later. "These networks handle operations too sensitive for normal channels, coordinate responses to threats that can't be acknowledged publicly, provide backup capabilities when primary systems are compromised." Riley had learned to access these shadow frequencies using techniques that weren't covered in any manual, procedures that required intimate knowledge of how classified communication systems actually functioned rather than how they were supposed to function according to official doctrine. Thomas had made her practice frequency combinations until she could input them automatically under stress, taught her authentication codes that would identify her as someone authorized to request assistance through channels that didn't officially exist. "The most important thing to remember," he'd emphasized, during their final training session before his last deployment, "is that these frequencies are monitored by people who've dedicated their lives to operating in the shadows. They don't respond to casual requests or routine emergencies. They respond when someone demonstrates that they possess knowledge that couldn't have been acquired through normal means. When someone proves they're connected to operations that require absolute discretion." The authentication procedures Thomas had taught Riley were more complex than simple calsigns or frequency combinations. They required her to demonstrate understanding of operational concepts that weren't taught in standard military training, to use terminology that would identify her as someone with access to classified information, to speak in ways that would prove her connection to the shadowy world where her father had spent his career. Thomas had explained that the shadow networks operated on principles of inherited trust, that credibility was passed from one generation to the next through knowledge that couldn't be faked or improvised. "If something happens to me," he'd told Riley with characteristic directness, "if I disappear or die under circumstances that don't make sense, You need to understand that my work created enemies who might someday threaten our family. The frequencies I'm teaching you aren't just communication tools. They're lifelines that connect you to people who owe me favors, who remember debts that can't be repaid to a dead man but can be honored by helping his daughter. Riley had learned to operate equipment that officially didn't exist, to understand communication protocols that weren't documented in any accessible source, to navigate bureaucratic structures that operated outside normal military hierarchy. Thomas had shown her how to recognize coded messages embedded in routine transmissions, how to decode information that appeared to be random technical data, how to extract intelligence from sources that seemed completely unrelated to military operations. The technical knowledge had been supplemented by psychological training that prepared Riley for situations where normal support systems wouldn't be available. Thomas had taught her to remain calm during emergencies that would paralyze most people, to think clearly when adrenaline threatened to override rational decision-making, to make correct choices when wrong choices would result in death. Fear is information, he'd explained during stress testing exercises that had pushed Riley to her emotional limits. It tells you that danger exists, but it shouldn't control your response to that danger. The goal is to acknowledge fear without being paralyzed by it, to use that information to make better decisions rather than worse ones. Perhaps most importantly, Thomas had taught Riley to trust her instincts about communication, anomalies that others might dismiss as coincidence or equipment malfunction. Professionals who want to disrupt our operations understand how our systems work, he'd explained. They know how to create interference patterns that look natural, how to jam frequencies in ways that appear to be atmospheric conditions, how to compromise our communications without triggering obvious alarms. Learning to recognize the difference between natural interference and intentional disruption could save your life someday. The training had concluded with exercises that simulated real combat situations. Scenarios where Riley had to maintain communication under extreme stress while dealing with equipment failures, hostile interference, and time pressures that demanded immediate action. Thomas had critiqued her performance with the same intensity he brought to training professional soldiers, refusing to accept anything less than excellence from his daughter. "You're not just learning to use radios," he'd told her during their final session together. "You're learning to survive in a world where enemies understand our capabilities better than we'd like to admit, where the difference between life and death often comes down to knowledge that can't be acquired through normal channels. If you ever need help that can't come through official channels, if you ever find yourself in a situation where standard procedures offer no solutions, remember that some frequencies are monitored by people who don't officially exist, but who remember their obligations to those who served beside them." Riley had absorbed every lesson, practiced every technique, memorized every frequency combination and authentication code her father had taught her. She'd assumed the knowledge would remain theoretical, interesting technical concepts that might someday prove useful in her electrical engineering career, but would never be tested under real combat conditions she'd never imagined. That 3 years after her father's death, she'd find herself surrounded by enemies in a remote mountain outpost, using his shadow frequencies to call for help that couldn't arrive through normal means, speaking authentication codes that would prove her connection to operations that had died with him. But Thomas Hawthorne had prepared his daughter well, teaching her that some knowledge transcends death, that some frequencies remain open even when official channels fall silent, that love sometimes takes the form of impossible preparation for unthinkable situations. The mission briefing at 0530 hours had felt routine, almost boring in its predictability. Captain Derek Reynolds stood before the assembled squad with the same tired expression he wore for every patrol assignment, pointing at satellite images of Firebase Crimson while explaining objectives that seemed straightforward enough to complete before lunch. Intelligence suggests possible insurgent activity at this abandoned Soviet outpost, he'd announced, his voice carrying the monotone delivery of someone who'd given identical briefings dozens of times. Standard reconnaissance patrol. Get in, assess the situation, gather whatever intelligence exists, and return to base by 1800 hours. Riley had studied the mission parameters with the analytical mind her father had trained her to use, noting details that seemed insignificant to others, but triggered subtle warning signals in her consciousness. The Firebase's location was strategically positioned to monitor 3 mountain passes, making it valuable terrain that insurgents would want to control. The intelligence reports were unusually vague, lacking the specific details that typically accompanied genuine reconnaissance requests. Most concerning was the communication plan, which relied entirely on standard frequencies, without backup protocols for terrain that was notorious for disrupting radio signals. During equipment checks, Riley had approached Corporal Morrison with concerns she couldn't articulate clearly. "Something feels off about this mission," she'd told him while inspecting her radio gear with more than usual attention to detail. "The intel is too thin. The communication plan doesn't account for mountain interference. And we're going in with minimal support for a location that should rate higher security protocols." Morrison had shrugged off her concerns with the casual dismissal that characterized most soldiers' attitudes toward routine patrols. "You worry too much, Hawthorne. It's a milk run. We'll be back in time for evening chow." But Riley's instincts, sharpened by years of her father's training, continued to signal danger throughout the morning preparation period. She'd quietly modified her radio configuration to include alternative frequency settings that weren't part of standard patrol procedures, adding backup communication channels that would function if primary systems failed. Her teammates had assumed she was being overly cautious, not understanding that Riley's technical modifications were based on knowledge that exceeded normal military training. The helicopter insertion at 0800 hours had proceeded without incident, the crew dropping Riley's squad at a landing zone 3 kilometers from Firebase Crimson before departing to support other operations in the region. The mountain air was crisp and thin, visibility perfect across terrain that rolled away in all directions like a topographical map rendered in earth and stone. Riley had used the approach march to study the landscape with tactical awareness her father had taught her, noting sight lines, communication dead zones, and terrain features that could either provide cover or become killing zones depending on circumstances. As they'd moved closer to the target location, Riley's unease had intensified rather than diminished. The absence of enemy activity should have been reassuring, but instead it felt ominous, like the calm that precedes violent storms. Her father had taught her to recognize patterns that suggested careful planning rather than random chance, to distinguish between genuine quiet and the artificial silence that results from hostile forces maintaining strict discipline while preparing ambushes. Firebase Crimson itself had appeared exactly as described in intelligence reports: abandoned, partially collapsed, overgrown with vegetation that suggested years of neglect. But Riley had noticed details that troubled her: footprints in areas where no footprints should exist, equipment positions that had been recently disturbed, sight lines that had been carefully cleared of obstacles. Someone had been using this location recently, and they'd been preparing it for purposes that weren't immediately obvious. During the initial sweep of the Firebase perimeter, Riley had tested her radio equipment and discovered the first concrete evidence that her concerns were justified. Standard communication frequencies were experiencing interference patterns that didn't match normal atmospheric conditions or terrain effects. The interference was subtle but consistent, suggesting intentional jamming using equipment sophisticated enough to disrupt military communications without triggering obvious alarms. Someone was actively working to isolate Riley's squad from outside support, She'd reported her findings to Captain Reynolds, but he dismissed them as routine technical difficulties that occurred frequently in mountainous terrain. Mountain operations always involve communication challenges, he'd told her with the confidence of someone who'd never been trained to recognize the difference between natural interference and hostile action. We'll maintain radio contact according to standard procedures. If problems develop, we'll deal with them as they arise. Riley had wanted to press the issue, to explain that the interference patterns she was detecting suggested enemy forces with access to military-grade communication equipment and detailed knowledge of coalition frequency allocations. But military hierarchy didn't encourage junior enlisted personnel to argue with officers about technical matters, especially when those concerns were based on knowledge that couldn't be explained without revealing classified training she wasn't supposed to possess. Instead, she'd quietly continued her technical analysis while the squad began its systematic search of the Firebase interior. The interference patterns were becoming stronger and more sophisticated as time passed, suggesting that hostile forces were increasing their electronic warfare activities in preparation for some kind of action. Riley had realized with growing certainty that her squad was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap, but she lacked the authority or credible explanation necessary to convince her superiors to abort the mission. The morning had stretched into afternoon with steadily increasing tension that only Riley seemed to notice. Her teammates had relaxed as they found no immediate evidence of enemy presence, but Riley's technical monitoring had revealed increasing levels of electronic surveillance that suggested they were being watched by forces with significant technical capabilities. Every radio check with base headquarters had become more difficult, requiring multiple attempts to establish clear communication through interference that was definitely intentional rather than natural. By 1400 hours, Riley had detected at least 6 different signal sources creating overlapping interference patterns designed to isolate the Firebase from outside communication. The sophistication of the electronic warfare suggested enemy forces with military training and access to equipment that shouldn't have been able to typical insurgent groups. Someone with detailed knowledge of coalition communication procedures was orchestrating a trap that had been planned with professional precision. Riley had made one final attempt to communicate her concerns to Captain Reynolds, explaining that the communication difficulties they were experiencing suggested imminent hostile action. "Sir, I'm detecting deliberate jamming patterns that indicate we're under electronic surveillance by forces with military-grade equipment. Respectfully recommend immediate extraction before they complete whatever operation they're preparing." Reynolds had listened with obvious impatience before dismissing her concerns as technical paranoia. "Sergeant Hawthorne, your job is to maintain communication, not to analyze enemy intentions. Continue monitoring our radio frequencies and report when you have concrete intelligence rather than theoretical concerns." As afternoon shadows had begun lengthening across the Firebase, Riley had realized that her squad was approaching the moment when theoretical danger would become immediate threat. The enemy forces conducting electronic surveillance had been patient and professional, waiting for optimal conditions before revealing their presence. Riley's technical analysis suggested they were facing opponents who understood coalition tactics better than they should have, who had prepared this ambush with knowledge that indicated possible intelligence leaks at higher command levels. The waiting had become almost unbearable as Riley watched her teammates continue their routine search procedures while enemy forces moved invisibly into position around the Firebase perimeter. Her father's training had taught her to recognize the psychological pressure that precedes violent action, the tension that builds when professional soldiers prepare to transition from surveillance to combat. Every instinct she possessed was screaming warnings that her squad was seconds away from finding themselves in a fight they weren't prepared for against enemies who had chosen the time, place, and circumstances of engagement when the first mortar rounds had begun impacting around Firebase Crimson. Rayleigh's only surprise had been that the attack had taken so long to begin. The first mortar round impacted 15 meters from where Captain Reynolds was examining a pile of discarded Soviet-era ammunition. The explosion sending a column of dirt and debris skyward, while the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery filled the mountain air with deadly promise. Riley threw herself behind a crumbling concrete wall as shrapnel peppered the ground where she'd been standing seconds earlier, her heart hammering against her ribs as the reality of ambush transformed from theoretical concern into immediate survival crisis. "Contact! Contact! We are taking indirect fire!" Reynolds shouted into his radio, his voice cracking with the sudden transition from routine patrol to combat emergency. But his transmission was met with static and electronic interference that confirmed Rayleigh's worst fears. The enemy had timed their attack to coincide with complete communication blackout, isolating the squad from any possibility of outside support. The sophisticated jamming she'd been detecting all afternoon had intensified into total spectrum denial, cutting them off from headquarters, air support, and any hope of calling for extraction. Within 30 seconds of the first mortar impact, muzzle flashes erupted from concealed positions along 3 ridgelines surrounding Firebase Crimson, creating a deadly crossfire that pinned Riley's squad in the open area at the center of the abandoned outpost. The enemy had obviously spent considerable time preparing this killing zone, positioning their forces to eliminate any possible escape routes, while maintaining overlapping fields of fire that made movement suicidal. Tracer rounds streaked across the firebase like deadly fireflies, impacting against concrete barriers and ricocheting into the afternoon sky with metallic screams. Corporal Morrison crawled toward Rayleigh's position, his face pale with the realization that their routine reconnaissance mission had become a carefully orchestrated death trap. "How many do you count?" he shouted over the increasing volume of incoming fire, his training taking over despite the shock of sudden combat. Riley forced herself to analyze the tactical situation with the clinical detachment her father had taught her, counting muzzle flashes and estimating enemy positions based on the pattern of incoming rounds. "At least 30 hostiles." "Probably more," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "They've got us zeroed from 3 directions, professional positioning with interlocking fields of fire. This isn't random insurgent activity. Someone with military training planned this ambush." Even as she spoke, Riley was mentally cataloging the equipment failures that had made this trap possible. Communication jamming that required sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities, coordinated mortar fire that suggested professional artillery training, and tactical positioning that indicated detailed knowledge of coalition patrol procedures. Captain Reynolds attempted repeatedly to establish radio contact with forward operating base sentinel, his transmissions becoming increasingly desperate as the enemy fire intensified around their position. "Sentinel base, this is Falcon Team. We are under heavy attack at Firebase Crimson, requesting immediate air support and extraction." But every transmission was met with impenetrable static, the enemy jamming so comprehensive that even emergency frequencies were completely blocked. The realization that they were truly isolated began settling over the squad like a suffocating blanket. Private Jessica Chen, the squad's youngest member at 19 years old, had taken cover behind a pile of rusted metal drums when a burst of automatic weapons fire stitched across the containers, sending sparks flying and forcing her to press herself flat against the ground. "They're moving closer," she screamed, pointing toward shadows that were advancing methodically down the eastern ridgeline. The enemy forces were conducting a textbook assault, using suppressive fire to pin the defenders, while maneuvering elements closed the distance for final assault. Specialist Robert Torres, positioned near the firebase's northern wall, attempted to return fire with his M4 rifle, but was immediately forced back into cover by concentrated enemy response. "They know exactly where we are," he shouted. "Every time I try to shoot, they're already aiming at my position." His observation confirmed what Riley had suspected. The enemy had been conducting detailed surveillance of the firebase, probably for hours or even days, mapping every defensive position and planning their attack with professional precision. The mortar barrage intensified, with rounds impacting in a systematic pattern, designed to destroy any effective cover while driving the defenders into increasingly smaller areas of relative safety. Riley realized that the enemy artillery was being directed by forward observers who could see the entire firebase, adjusting their fire based on real-time intelligence about defender movements. The sophistication of the attack suggested military training that exceeded anything typical insurgent groups possessed. Sergeant Davis, the squad's most experienced NCO with 3 combat deployments, had established a defensive position near the firebase's central communications bunker when a mortar round impacted directly overhead, the explosion sending him tumbling across the rocky ground with blood streaming from multiple shrapnel wounds. Morrison attempted to reach him but was driven back by accurate sniper fire that suggested the enemy possessed precision weapons and trained marksmen positioned to prevent any rescue attempts. "We're being systematically eliminated," Riley realized, watching as enemy forces continued their methodical advance while maintaining devastating fire superiority. The attackers were demonstrating tactical discipline that indicated professional military background rather than improvised insurgent activity. They moved with coordinated precision, communicated through what appeared to be sophisticated radio equipment, and employed weapons that suggested access to military supply chains. Captain Reynolds, bleeding from a head wound caused by concrete fragments, crawled toward Riley's position with desperation replacing his earlier confidence. "Hawthorne, you're our communication specialist. Find a way to call for help. Use emergency frequencies, try different channels, override the jamming somehow." His voice carried the edge of panic that comes when professional soldiers realize their training hasn't prepared them for the level of opposition they're facing. Riley had already been analyzing their communication options, testing different frequency combinations and power settings in an attempt to penetrate the enemy jamming. Standard military frequencies were completely blocked. Emergency channels were experiencing total interference, and even backup communication methods were being systematically neutralized by electronic warfare that exceeded anything she'd encountered during training. The enemy clearly possessed detailed knowledge of coalition communication procedures and had prepared countermeasures for every standard option. Private Chun's position became untenable when enemy forces began using rocket-propelled grenades to eliminate defensive cover systematically. She attempted to move to a more protected location, but was caught in the open when an RPG round impacted against the wall she'd been using for cover, the explosion sending her sprawling with obvious injuries to her left leg and arm. Torres tried to provide covering fire for her movement but was immediately suppressed by concentrated automatic weapons fire from multiple positions. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly as enemy forces demonstrated their ability to neutralize any defensive response while continuing their methodical advance toward final assault positions. Riley understood that her squad had perhaps 10 minutes before the attackers would be close enough to overrun their positions entirely, ending the battle with close-quarters combat that would leave no survivors. Every standard procedure her military training had taught her was proving useless against opponents who seemed to understand coalition tactics better than the coalition forces themselves understood them. Normal communication channels were blocked. Standard defensive positions were being systematically destroyed. and conventional weapons were proving inadequate against professionally planned and executed assault. Riley realized that survival would require solutions that existed outside normal military doctrine, communication methods that weren't covered in standard training, and knowledge that her father had given her for exactly this type of impossible situation. The moment had arrived when official channels offered no hope, when standard procedures provided no solutions, when staying alive would depend on knowledge that officially didn't exist. She reached for the modified radio her father had left her, knowing that their only chance for rescue would come from frequencies that weren't supposed to be monitored by anyone still living, from networks that operated in the shadows beyond official acknowledgement. The time for conventional military response had passed. Now they needed help from people who didn't officially exist, using communication methods that couldn't be explained through normal channels. The enemy was closing in for the kill, unaware that they'd triggered a response from forces that operated beyond their understanding, from networks that remembered obligations that transcended death itself. Riley's hands moved with practiced precision despite the chaos erupting around Firebase Crimson, her fingers finding the modified radio her father had hidden in her gear with the muscle memory of countless training sessions conducted in the safety of their garage workshop. The device felt different from standard military equipment, heavier, more complex, with frequency controls that extended far beyond normal tactical radio specifications. As another mortar round exploded 30 meters away, showering her position with concrete debris, Riley forced herself to focus on the technical procedures her father had drilled into her during those late-night sessions that had seemed like paranoid fantasy until this moment. First step required bypassing the standard frequency allocation protocols that governed all official military communications. Riley disconnected the primary antenna array and activated the backup system her father had modified with components that weren't supposed to exist, creating a signal path that operated independently of normal communication infrastructure. Her movements were deliberate and methodical despite the incoming fire, each connection made with the precision of someone who understood that a single technical error would mean death for everyone in her squad. "What are you doing, Hawthorne?" Captain Reynolds shouted from his position 15 meters away, blood streaming down his face from shrapnel wounds that had narrowly missed his eyes. "Use the standard emergency frequencies. Call for immediate air support." Riley ignored his commands, knowing that standard procedures had already failed catastrophically, that conventional communication methods were being systematically blocked by enemies who understood coalition protocols better than most. Coalition forces understood them themselves. Modified radio came online with a series of indicator lights that weren't present on normal military equipment, displaying frequency ranges and signal strengths that extended into spectrum allocations she'd never seen during official training. Riley began inputting the frequency combination her father had made her memorize: 7.7.4.5.9, a sequence that defied standard communication protocols and accessed channels that officially didn't exist. Each number had to be entered with perfect accuracy while mortar rounds continued impacting around the firebase, creating a technical challenge that would have been difficult under laboratory conditions, but seemed impossible during active combat. Corporal Morrison crawled toward her position, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone. "Riley, we need help now. Whatever you're doing, make it work fast. They're getting ready for final assault." His voice carried the desperate edge of someone who could see enemy forces maneuvering into positions for close-quarters combat that would end with no survivors. Riley completed the frequency input and activated the transmission system, feeling the radio's power output increase beyond normal specifications as it accessed communication channels that bypassed standard military infrastructure entirely. The authentication sequence her father had taught her required more than simple call signs or identification codes. Riley had to demonstrate knowledge that proved her connection to operations that existed in the classified shadows beyond official acknowledgement, using terminology and procedures that would identify her as someone with access to information that couldn't be acquired through normal military training. She pressed the transmit button and spoke with the controlled precision her father had demanded during their practice sessions. Phantom 7 Network. This is Nightfall 7 requesting emergency assistance under Protocol Lambda, Riley transmitted. Using the authentication sequence her father had embedded in her memory through repetitive training. Transmitting from grid reference 36.2847 north, 71.5639 east, Firebase Crimson. 12 coalition personnel under coordinated assault by Superior. Hostile force with military-grade equipment and communication jamming capabilities. Primary command communication severed. Standard extraction procedures compromised. Requesting immediate tactical support from any available shadow assets. The radio remained silent for 10 seconds that stretched like hours while enemy fire continued intensifying around their position. Rayleigh's heart hammered against her ribs as she wondered whether the frequency her father had given her was still monitored, whether the shadow networks he'd described actually existed, whether anyone would respond to authentication codes from a dead man's daughter. Then the radio crackled with a transmission that sent ice water through her veins and hope flooding back into her. Tactical situation. Nightfall 7. This is Phantom 7 Actual. The voice was unmistakable despite 3 years of silence, carrying the same calm authority that had guided Riley through countless training exercises in their garage workshop. Authentication confirmed. Lambda protocol authorized. Your father's frequency codes remain active in this network. Tactical support is already en route to your position. Riley stared at the radio with tears streaming down her face, unable to process how her father's voice could be responding to her emergency call, unable to understand how someone officially dead could be coordinating rescue operations from frequencies that weren't supposed to exist. Morrison grabbed her shoulder, his voice urgent with confusion. Who is that? How do they know about Lambda protocol? That's not in any manual I've ever seen. Before Riley could attempt an explanation, she didn't understand herself. Her father's voice continued with tactical instructions that demonstrated intimate knowledge of their current situation. Nightfall 7. Hostile forces surrounding your position are equipped with coalition communication intercept capabilities and detailed intelligence about standard extraction procedures. They've been monitoring normal military frequencies and planned this ambush to occur during communication blackout window. Maintain your current defensive positions. Shadow assets are approaching from vector 270 degrees. At 4 minutes. The tactical information was impossibly accurate, suggesting that whoever was transmitting as Phantom 7 had real-time intelligence about the enemy forces attacking Firebase Crimson. Riley looked toward the western ridgeline her father had indicated and saw nothing except rocky terrain and sparse vegetation. No evidence of approaching friendly forces or any indication that rescue was possible. But her father's voice had carried the confidence of someone who possessed information but was visible from her current position. Nightfall 7. Prepare for electronic countermeasures deployment in 60 seconds. The transmission continued. Hostile jamming equipment will be neutralized through directed energy pulse. When communication blackout ends, standard tactical frequencies will be restored and normal extraction procedures will become viable. Until then, maintain defensive positions and conserve ammunition. Riley began counting down from 60 seconds, while enemy forces continued their methodical advance toward final assault positions. At exactly the predicted moment, the electronic interference that had been blocking all normal communication channels suddenly ceased. Replaced by clear signal conditions, that allowed standard military radios to function normally. Captain Reynolds immediately began transmitting distress calls on emergency frequencies, his voice carrying desperate relief as he established contact with forward operating Base Sentinel. Sentinel Base. This is Falcon Team at Firebase Crimson. We are under heavy attack by superior hostile force. Require immediate air support and medical evacuation. His transmission was answered immediately by base communications, indicating that the communication blackout had been completely eliminated, exactly as Phantom 7 had predicted. Riley watched in amazement as her father's impossible intervention restored their connection to normal military support systems within minutes. The radio was crackling with confirmation that air support was en route to their position. Falcon Team, this is Angel Flight with 2 Apache gunships and 1 medevac helicopter, ETA 8 minutes. Maintain your current positions and mark hostile targets with laser designation when possible. The approaching aircraft represented conventional military response that had become available only after Phantom 7's intervention had neutralized the enemy's electronic warfare capabilities. Riley continued monitoring the shadow frequency that had connected her to her father's voice, listening for additional transmissions that might explain how dead men could coordinate tactical operations from beyond the grave. But the channel remained silent except for brief status updates, confirming that friendly forces were approaching and enemy jamming remained neutralized. Her father's presence had manifested long enough to save their lives before disappearing back into whatever realm existed beyond official acknowledgement. The sound of approaching helicopters began echoing across the mountain terrain as coalition air support arrived exactly on schedule, their weapons systems targeting enemy positions that had been precisely identified through intelligence that couldn't have come from normal reconnaissance. Riley realized that her father's shadow network possessed capabilities that exceeded anything she'd imagined during their training sessions. Resources that operated independently of official military command while maintaining the ability to coordinate with conventional forces when circumstances required. It knowledge her father had passed to her during those garage workshop sessions had proven to be more than theoretical concepts or paranoid preparation. It had been practical training for accessing resources that could save lives when normal procedures failed. Catastrophically, the Apache gunships arrived like avenging angels, their rotor wash creating dust storms across Firebase Crimson as they established attack patterns that seemed impossibly precise for aircraft responding to a routine distress call. Instead of conducting standard reconnaissance to identify hostile positions, the pilots immediately began engaging specific targets with the accuracy of forces that had been provided detailed intelligence about enemy locations, equipment, and tactical dispositions. Riley watched in amazement as the lead Apache pilot transmitted coordinates that perfectly matched the enemy positions she'd been observing, suggesting that the incoming air support possessed battlefield awareness that couldn't have been acquired through normal reconnaissance procedures. Falcon Team. This is Angel Lead. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled through the restored communication channels. We have precise targeting data for hostile positions surrounding your location. Maintain defensive positions while we neutralize threats with danger close fire support. The terminology danger close indicated that the helicopters would be firing very near friendly positions, a procedure that required absolute confidence in target identification and friendly force locations. Riley realized that the pilots possessed intelligence about the tactical situation that could only have come from sources with real-time observation capabilities. As the Apache helicopters engaged enemy positions with devastating accuracy, Riley continued monitoring the shadow frequency that had connected her to her father's impossible transmission. The channel remained active but quiet, carrying only brief status updates that confirmed friendly forces were approaching and hostile capabilities were being systematically neutralized. She found herself speaking into the radio despite knowing that others could hear her, addressing someone who couldn't logically be listening, but who had somehow coordinated their rescue. Phantom 7. This is Nightfall 7, she transmitted quietly, using the modified radio that had accessed frequencies beyond official military recognition. How is this possible? How are you coordinating tactical support 3 years after Afghanistan? The official reports said you were killed in action. Body never recovered. Mission classified beyond my security clearance. Her voice carried the confusion of someone whose understanding of reality had been fundamentally challenged by events that couldn't be explained through normal logic. The response came immediately. Her father's voice carrying the same patient tone he'd used during their training sessions when explaining concepts that seemed impossible until demonstrated practically. Kiddo, some operations continue beyond official acknowledgement. Some assignments don't end with death, and some networks operate independently of normal command structures. The shadow frequencies I taught you connect to resources that exist specifically for situations like this, when conventional military response isn't sufficient, when threats exceed normal tactical parameters, when survival depends on capabilities that officially don't exist. Corporal Morrison, bleeding from multiple shrapnel wounds but still conscious, stared at Riley with the expression of someone trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he understood about military operations. Hawthorne, who are you talking to? How do they know details about our tactical situation that we never transmitted? And why do they sound like they know you personally? His questions reflected the confusion that Riley felt, but couldn't adequately explain even to herself. Apache helicopters continued their precise engagement of enemy positions, their targeting so accurate that hostile fire decreased dramatically within minutes of their arrival. Riley could see enemy forces attempting to withdraw from positions that were being systematically destroyed by air support that seemed to possess perfect intelligence about their locations and movement patterns. The coordination between the shadow network and conventional military forces suggested integration between official and unofficial resources that operated seamlessly despite existing in completely different command structures. Nightfall 7. Hostile forces are attempting organized withdrawal toward pre-planned extraction points. Her father's voice transmitted with tactical awareness that indicated real-time observation of the battlefield. Angel Flight has been provided targeting data for extraction routes and rally points. Enemy withdrawal will be interdicted to prevent regrouping and future operations against coalition forces in this sector. The level of intelligence being demonstrated exceeded anything Riley had experienced during normal military operations. The Shadow Network apparently possessed surveillance capabilities that allowed real-time monitoring of enemy movements, communication intercepts that revealed their tactical planning, and the ability to coordinate with conventional forces without appearing in normal command channels. Riley began to understand that her father's work with the Phantom Network had created resources that continued operating independently of official military acknowledgement. Captain Reynolds, his head wound bandaged with field dressing that was already soaked with blood, approached Riley's position with questions that reflected his growing awareness that their rescue was occurring through channels he didn't understand. Sergeant Hawthorne, I need to know what communication method you used to coordinate this air support. The response time was impossibly fast, the intelligence was impossibly accurate, and the targeting data came from sources that aren't in our operational databases. How did you access resources that I've never heard of in 15 years of military service? Riley looked at her commanding officer with the realization that explaining the truth would require discussing classified information she wasn't supposed to possess, operations that officially didn't exist, and a father who was supposed to be dead but had somehow coordinated their tactical rescue. "Sir, my father was Major Thomas Hawthorne, Special Operations Communications Specialist. Before his death in Afghanistan, he taught me emergency procedures that included access to backup networks for situations when normal military resources aren't available." The explanation was technically accurate but didn't begin to address the impossibility of receiving tactical support from someone who had died 3 years ago. Reynolds studied her with the expression of someone who recognized that important information was being withheld but who also understood that their survival had depended on resources beyond his security clearance level. "Your father's backup network saved our lives, Sergeant. I won't ask questions about capabilities I'm not authorized to know about." The medevac helicopter arrived as the Apache gunships completed their engagement of hostile forces, landing in the center of Firebase Crimson to evacuate wounded personnel while maintaining security overwatch. The medical team that emerged from the aircraft moved with professional efficiency, immediately beginning treatment for Sergeant Davis, Private Chun, and other squad members who had sustained injuries during the ambush. Riley realized that the medical evacuation had been coordinated with the same precision that characterized the air support, suggesting that multiple resources were being managed through the shadow network her father had access. As wounded personnel were being prepared for evacuation, Riley's modified radio crackled with a final transmission from Phantom 7 that provided context for everything that had occurred. Nightfall 7. Enemy forces that attacked your position were equipped with coalition communication equipment and detailed intelligence about patrol procedures, suggesting compromise at higher command levels. This ambush was specifically designed to eliminate personnel who might investigate security breaches. Your survival ensures that appropriate authorities will be alerted to potential intelligence compromises. The revelation that their ambush had been orchestrated using inside information explained the professional coordination of enemy forces, their access to military-grade equipment, and their detailed knowledge of coalition tactical procedures. Riley understood that her squad had been targeted not randomly, but specifically, possibly because their reconnaissance mission might have uncovered evidence of security breaches that threatened ongoing operations. The shadow network had intervened, not just to save their lives, but to preserve information that was critical to broader security concerns. Phantom 7, will I be able to contact this network again, if necessary? Riley asked, knowing that she might need to report intelligence about the security compromise, but uncertain whether the shadow frequencies would remain accessible for future communications. The response carried finality that suggested their connection was concluding. "The frequencies remain active, kiddo, but use them only when conventional channels offer no solutions. Some resources exist specifically for impossible situations. Remember what I taught you about when silence becomes more dangerous than speaking up. You'll know when the time comes." Her father's voice carried the same guidance he'd provided during their training sessions, wisdom that transcended the impossibility of their current communication. As the medevac helicopter prepared for departure with wounded personnel aboard, Riley realized that her connection to the shadow network was ending as mysteriously as it had begun, leaving her with questions about reality that would probably never be answered, but with absolute certainty that her father's legacy continued, protecting those he cared about through resources that existed beyond official acknowledgement. 6 months after Firebase Crimson, Riley stood in the classified briefing room at Pentagon Annex Building 7, facing a panel of senior intelligence officials whose security clearances exceeded anything she'd imagined existed during her time as a junior enlisted communications specialist. The investigation into the security breach that had made the ambush possible had led to discoveries that reached into the highest levels of coalition command structure, exposing a network of compromised personnel who had been feeding operational intelligence to hostile forces for over 2 years. The evidence Riley had provided about enemy forces possessing detailed knowledge of coalition communication procedures, combined with analysis of equipment recovered from the battlefield, had triggered a comprehensive counterintelligence operation that uncovered systematic infiltration of military communication networks. 3 high-ranking officers had been arrested, 2 defense contractors had lost their security clearances, and entire communication protocols had been redesigned to prevent future compromise of operational security. Colonel Patricia Valdez, the same officer who had spoken at her father's funeral 3 years earlier, now served as Riley's sponsor for advanced training opportunities that recognized her unique capabilities and the circumstances that had brought them to official attention. "Sergeant Hawthorne," she said during their private meeting following the intelligence briefing, "your actions at Firebase Crimson not only saved your squad, but exposed security vulnerabilities that threatened ongoing operations throughout this theater. The military needs personnel who can think beyond standard procedures when facing threats that exceed conventional parameters." Riley had been offered several career opportunities that reflected her demonstrated abilities. Advanced training incurred several career opportunities that reflected her demonstrated abilities. Advanced traded abilities. Electronic warfare. Assignment to classified communication projects. Promotion to officer rank with specialization in unconventional warfare support. But each opportunity came with security requirements that would have restricted her ability to discuss her experiences, effectively silencing her about events that had fundamentally changed her understanding of military service and her father's legacy. Instead, Riley had chosen a path that honored both her technical capabilities and her desire to ensure that other military personnel could access the knowledge necessary to survive impossible situations. She'd accepted assignment to the Army's Communication Training Command with authorization to develop curriculum that taught advanced emergency communication procedures to selected personnel throughout all service branches. The program was designated Phantom Protocol, in unofficial recognition of the shadow network that had demonstrated its value during her rescue. The first class of students to receive Phantom Protocol training included carefully selected personnel from special operations units, intelligence services, and communication specialists who might someday find themselves in situations where conventional procedures offered no solutions. Riley taught them frequency combinations that existed outside normal allocation procedures, authentication methods that would identify them as personnel authorized to access emergency support networks, and technical skills that would enable communication when standard equipment failed. The most important lesson, Riley told her students during advanced training sessions that took place in facilities with security classifications that required special clearances, is understanding that some resources exist specifically for situations when everything else fails. These frequencies aren't for routine communication or normal emergencies. They're for moments when survival depends on reaching people who operate beyond official acknowledgement, when conventional military response isn't sufficient for the threats you're facing. Riley never explicitly mentioned her father's voice responding to her emergency call, never discussed the impossibility of receiving tactical support from someone who had died 3 years earlier, never attempted to explain phenomena that exceeded rational understanding. Instead, she focused on practical skills that would enable her students to access resources that officially didn't exist while maintaining the security requirements that protected shadow network operations from hostile intelligence services. The modified radio her father had left her became the template for equipment that was issued to Phantom Protocol graduates, devices that could access frequencies beyond standard military specifications, while maintaining security features that prevented unauthorized use. Each radio was registered to specific personnel who had demonstrated both technical competence and psychological stability necessary to operate in gray areas between official doctrine and operational necessity. During evening hours when her teaching duties were complete, Riley continued monitoring the shadow frequencies her father had taught her, listening for transmissions that might indicate other personnel in need of emergency assistance. She never again heard her father's voice speaking directly to her, but she occasionally detected brief status reports and coordination messages that suggested the shadow network remained active and continued, providing support for operations that existed beyond public acknowledgement. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, Riley's commanding officer in the Communication Training Command, had become aware through classified channels that Phantom protocol was based on real-world experience that had saved lives during actual combat operations. "Your curriculum is being implemented throughout NATO forces," she informed Riley during a quarterly review meeting. "Personnel trained in these procedures have already used them successfully during 3 separate incidents when conventional communication was compromised. The knowledge you're passing forward is making a measurable difference in survival rates." Riley found deep satisfaction in knowing that her father's legacy was expanding through each class of students who learned to access resources that could save lives when normal procedures failed. The techniques he'd taught her during those garage workshop sessions were now being transmitted to personnel throughout the military community, ensuring that knowledge of shadow frequencies would survive and continue protecting those who served in dangerous circumstances. The program also served as a memorial to Major Thomas Hawthorne and other personnel who had died, developing capabilities that existed in classified shadows beyond public recognition. A small plaque in the Phantom Protocol training facility honored communication specialists who gave their lives advancing technologies that continue protecting their brothers and sisters in arms. Riley touched that plaque every morning before beginning classes, whispering words that had become her daily ritual. "Thank you for the inheritance that keeps saving lives." "Dad," on the 3rd anniversary of her father's death, Riley received an envelope with no return address, delivered through channels that bypassed normal postal systems. Inside was a single photograph showing Thomas Hawthorne standing beside communication equipment in what appeared to be a cave or underground facility, with a handwritten note on the back. "Some missions continue beyond official acknowledgement. Some frequencies remain open for those who need them. Well done, kiddo. Phantom 7 remains operational." Riley studied the photograph with tears streaming down her face, understanding that questions about her father's fate would probably never be answered through conventional investigation, but knowing with absolute certainty that his influence continued protecting people through knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Whether he was alive in some underground facility or dead, but remembered by colleagues who honored his legacy, the practical result remained the same. Resources existed for those who knew how to access them. Frequencies remained monitored for those who needed help beyond what official channels could provide. Core lesson her father had taught her during those late-night training sessions had proven true in ways she'd never imagined. Knowledge was the most important inheritance parents could give their children. Wisdom that transcended death and continued protecting long after the teacher was gone. Love took many forms, but perhaps the most powerful was the gift of capabilities that could save lives when facing dangers that exceeded imagination. Riley's students graduated knowing they possessed access to resources that might never be needed, but that would be available if impossible situations demanded impossible solutions. They understood that some frequencies were monitored by people who operated in shadows beyond official acknowledgement, but who remembered their obligations to those who served. Most importantly, they learned that inheritance wasn't always material. Sometimes the most valuable legacy was knowledge that enabled survival when conventional wisdom offered no hope. The sky always listened. Riley told her classes for those who remembered the right frequencies to call. And somewhere in frequencies beyond normal hearing, perhaps voices continued responding to those who carried forward the knowledge necessary to bridge the gap between impossible situations and miraculous rescues. Some connections transcended death. Some networks operated beyond official acknowledgement, And some legacies lived on through the lives they continued saving long after their creators had passed into legend. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.